After 12 years abroad, Nolan Mercer returned to Missouri believing he had done everything a good son was supposed to do. He had sent money home every month. He had called whenever he could. He had trusted his family. But on a cold afternoon beside an abandoned highway stop, he found an old man sleeping under a torn blanket with a battered suitcase pressed against his chest. The man was his father, and before Nolan could even process what he was seeing, Arthur whispered something that made his blood run cold. "You cannot let Grant know you found me. If he learns I'm talking, everything will come out." Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. 3 days earlier, Nolan still believed his family was intact. His flight landed just after noon. As the private car carried him through the familiar Missouri roads, Nolan stared through the window and smiled to himself. It had been 12 years since he had left the country. 12 years of building a company from nothing. 12 years of late nights, failed deals, impossible deadlines, and risks that could have ruined him. Now he was returning home as one of the most successful logistics entrepreneurs in the industry. But the achievement he felt most proud of was not the company. It was the fact that he had never forgotten his father. Every month, without fail, Nolan transferred money home. His older brother Grant always assured him that Arthur was doing well. "Dad's comfortable," Grant would say. "Don't worry about him." And Nolan believed him. Why wouldn't he? Grant lived only 40 minutes away from Arthur. He was the one who saw their father regularly. At least that was what Nolan thought. His phone vibrated. "Grant." Nolan answered immediately. "Welcome back," Grant said. "Thanks. You should have told me your flight details. I would have picked you up." Nolan laughed. "You know I like surprises," Grant chuckled. "Well, Dad's doing fine. He's still stubborn as ever." The conversation felt normal. Too normal. Looking back, Nolan would remember that call for a long time, because nothing in Grant's voice hinted that anything was wrong. Not even a little. After hanging up, Nolan decided not to visit his hotel first. He wanted to see Arthur immediately. He stopped at a local bakery his father used to love and bought several boxes of pastries. Then he drove toward the family home. As he approached the neighborhood, something felt strange. The familiar streets looked different. Several houses had been renovated, new fences had appeared, old trees had been cut down. Still, he recognized the route. When he finally reached the property, he slowed the car. Then he frowned. The house looked nothing like he remembered. The exterior had been repainted, the porch had been rebuilt, even the mailbox was different. Confused, Nolan parked across the street. Maybe Grant had helped Arthur renovate. That seemed reasonable. He grabbed the pastries and walked to the front door. A woman in her 50s answered. She looked surprised. "Can I help you?" Nolan smiled politely. "I'm looking for Arthur Mercer." The woman's expression changed immediately. "Arthur Mercer?" "Yes." She shook her head. "You're mistaken. We bought this house almost 2 years ago." For a moment, Nolan thought he had heard her wrong. "Bought it?" "That's right." "From who?" "I don't know the details." The realtor handled everything. The pastries suddenly felt heavier in his hands. "What happened to Arthur?" The woman hesitated. "I'm sorry, I really don't know." Nolan thanked her and walked back toward his car. His heartbeat had begun to quicken. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He called Grant immediately. No answer. He called again. Still nothing. Then he spent the next several hours asking neighbors. Most avoided eye contact. A few claimed they had not seen Arthur in months. One elderly man finally spoke. "I saw him leave one day with a suitcase. Where did he go?" The man shrugged. "No idea." "Was Grant with him?" The neighbor looked uncomfortable. "Yes." Nolan felt a knot form in his stomach. That evening he barely slept. The next morning he continued searching. He visited churches, community centers, shelters. Anywhere someone might have seen an elderly man living alone. By late afternoon, exhaustion was beginning to take over. Then a volunteer at a food pantry mentioned something. "There's an older gentleman who sometimes stays near the abandoned highway stop outside town." Nolan immediately got into his car. The drive took nearly 40 minutes. As the city disappeared behind him, the roads became emptier. The old highway stop appeared ahead like a forgotten relic. Broken signs, boarded windows, cracked pavement, no businesses, no travelers, no life. Then his elderly man sitting beside a rusted picnic table. His coat was worn thin, his beard was untrimmed, a faded suitcase rested beside him. For several seconds Nolan simply stared. It couldn't be, but it was. Dad? Arthur slowly lifted his head, his eyes widened. The old man looked shocked, then afraid. Not relieved, not happy, afraid. Nolan? The pastry slipped from Nolan's hands and hit the pavement. He rushed forward. What happened to you? Arthur looked around nervously, as if someone might be watching. Keep your voice down. Nolan dropped to one knee. Dad, what is going on? Arthur's hands trembled. He grabbed Nolan's sleeve tightly. You cannot tell Grant you found me. Nolan froze. Why? Arthur looked toward the empty highway, his face filled with a fear that made no sense. The fear of a man who had already lost everything. Then he spoke words Nolan never expected to hear. The house wasn't taken because of money. Arthur swallowed hard. It was because of your uncle. Nolan stared at his father, certain he had misheard him. Uncle? Arthur's grip tightened around his sleeve. His weathered hands trembled, not from the cold, but from something deeper. Fear. Real fear. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Cars rushed past on the distant highway, their engines humming through the fading afternoon. The sound felt strangely disconnected from the moment. The world kept moving while Nolan seemed to have stopped. You never told me I had an uncle, Nolan finally said. Arthur lowered his eyes. I know. Nolan sat down on the opposite side of the rusted picnic table. Up close, the reality hurt even more. His father's coat was worn thin, his shoes was cracked. His face looked older than Nolan remembered. This was not a man who had chosen this life. This was a man who had been left behind. How long have you been here? Nolan asked quietly. Arthur avoided the question. Instead, he looked toward the abandoned building beside them. You shouldn't have come looking for me. The answer only increased Nolan's concern. Dad, stop. Arthur looked up. I'm serious. No. Nolan shook his head. I've spent 12 years believing you were safe. His voice cracked slightly. I sent money every month. Arthur's expression changed. A shadow crossed his face. What money? The question hit Nolan like a punch. For several seconds he simply stared. What do you mean, what money? Arthur frowned. Nolan pulled out his phone immediately. His banking records were still there. Transfer after transfer, month after month, year after year. He opened several transactions and handed the screen to Arthur. Arthur studied it carefully, then looked back up. His face had gone pale. Nolan, you never got any of this? Arthur slowly shook his head. The silence that followed felt unbearable. 12 years of believing he was helping. 12 years of trusting Grant. 12 years of being wrong. Nolan looked away. Anger began rising inside him. Not the quick kind, the dangerous kind, the slow burning kind. How much did Grant tell you I was sending? Arthur looked embarrassed. He said business wasn't going well. Nolan laughed once. There was no humor in it. Dad, my company was valued at over $1 billion last year. Arthur blinked. $1 billion? You didn't know? Arthur looked devastated. No, the realization hurt both of them. Grant had not only stolen money, he had stolen information. He had controlled what each of them knew about the other. For the first time, Nolan saw how isolation worked. Not through walls, through lies. Arthur suddenly looked exhausted. He leaned back against the bench. You should leave before it gets dark. No, Nolan, I'm not leaving you here. Arthur didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the cracked pavement. You always were stubborn. Nolan almost smiled. Almost. Then his expression hardened again. Tell me about the uncle. Arthur remained quiet. For so long that Nolan thought he might refuse. Finally he spoke. His name was Samuel Mercer. The name meant nothing to Nolan. Yet something about the way Arthur said it carried decades of weight. He was my older half-brother. Nolan frowned. You never mentioned him. Most people didn't. Arthur paused. Eventually nobody did. The wind blew through the empty lot. Arthur watched it move across the weeds. We lost contact many years ago. Why? Arthur shook his head. It's complicated. Try me. A faint smile appeared. Still impatient, Nolan leaned forward. Dad. Arthur's smile disappeared. I spent years looking for him. The confession surprised Nolan. You searched her for him? Arthur nodded. For a very long time. Why? The old man swallowed. Because I made a promise. A distant sadness entered his eyes. Nolan immediately understood who he meant. His mother. Even after all these years, mentioning her still changed Arthur. Mom knew about Samuel? Arthur nodded again. She believed family shouldn't disappear. The words lingered between them. She wanted me to find him. What happened? I tried. Arthur looked away. Every lead vanished. Vanished, phone numbers disconnected, addresses wrong, records unavailable, letters returned. Nolan listened carefully. Something felt wrong, not unfortunate, deliberate. Did you ever think someone was interfering? Arthur didn't answer immediately. That hesitation spoke louder than words. You did, Nolan said. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. Eventually, who? Arthur looked at him, pain flashed across his face. I didn't want to believe it. Nolan already knew the answer. Still, hearing it mattered. Grant? Arthur's silence confirmed everything. The sun continued sinking lower. Shadows stretched across the abandoned rest stop. For the first time, Nolan felt something inside him shift. Until now, Grant had been a distant problem, a confusing problem. Now he was becoming something else, a threat. Why would he care? Arthur rubbed his forehead. Because Samuel coming back would change things. What things? Arthur hesitated. Family things, that's not an answer, I know. Nolan stood and began pacing. His mind raced. Money missing, the house sold, years of lies, blocked communication, a forgotten uncle. None of it fit together, not yet. But he could feel the edges of something larger, something hidden. When he stopped pacing, he made a decision. We're leaving. Arthur looked up. What? You're not spending another night here? No. Yes. Nolan, no. The firmness in his voice surprised even him. For years he had trusted other people to take care of his father. That mistake was over. I'm getting you a room tonight. Arthur looked uncomfortable. I don't want charity. Nolan walked back toward him. This isn't charity. His voice softened. This is family. Arthur stared at him for several seconds, then looked away. The old man's eyes glistened. He didn't argue again. An hour later they were driving toward town. Arthur sat quietly in the passenger seat. The heater blew warm air through the cabin. For the first time all day he seemed slightly relaxed. As they approached the motel Nolan had booked, Arthur suddenly spoke. There's something else. Nolan glanced over. What? Arthur reached into the battered suitcase resting at his feet. His movements were slow, careful, almost nervous. Finally he pulled out a worn manila envelope. The edges were yellow with age. The seal had already been broken. Arthur stared at it for several seconds before handing it over. What is this? I found it years ago. Nolan opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. The image was old, faded, taken decades earlier. Two adult men stood side by side outside a farmhouse. One was clearly Arthur when he was much younger. The other had to be Samuel. But that wasn't what made Nolan's stomach tighten. Written across the back of the photograph in dark ink were 6 words. If Samuel turns, everything changes. And beneath the message was a signature. Grant Mercer. Nolan did not sleep that night. The photograph lay on the small table inside the motel room while Arthur rested in the bedroom. Every time Nolan looked at it, the same question returned. Why would Grant write those words? If Samuel returns, everything changes. It did not sound like a joke. It did not sound casual. It sounded like a warning or a threat. Around 6 in the morning, Nolan quietly left the motel room with the photograph and drove to a coffee shop a few miles away. He ordered black coffee and spread the evidence across the table. The old photograph, the banking records, the property address, a notebook. For the first time since finding Arthur, he stopped reacting and started thinking. His company had not become successful because of luck. It became successful because he followed facts. So he decided to treat this like an investigation, not a family argument, not yet. The first thing he did was search county property records. The family home appeared immediately. The ownership history showed exactly what he feared. The house had been sold 2 years earlier. The seller's name was listed as Arthur Mercer. Nolan stared at the screen. Arthur insisted he never agreed to sell, but his signature appeared on multiple documents. The more Nolan reviewed them, the less comfortable he felt. The signatures looked genuine, at least at first glance. That was what made the situation worse. Someone had either manipulated Arthur into signing something he did not understand or convinced him he had no choice. Neither possibility was acceptable. Nolan copied every available document and saved them. Then he drove back to the neighborhood where he had grown up. The woman who owned the house was not home, but an elderly neighbor was outside watering flowers. This time Nolan approached more carefully. The man recognized him immediately. You're Arthur's younger son. Nolan nodded. I am. The neighbor looked relieved. Your father needed someone. The statement landed heavily. Nolan swallowed. What happened here? The man set down the hose. For a few moments he seemed uncertain how much to say. Then he sighed. Things got ugly. What kind of ugly? Family ugly. Nolan waited. Your brother started showing up more often after your mother passed. That part made sense. Arthur's wife had died several years earlier. Grant had always claimed he stepped in to help afterward, the neighbor continued. At first everything seemed normal. Then people started hearing arguments. Nolan felt tension rise. What were they arguing about? The man shook his head, couldn't hear every word. But one name kept coming up. Nolan already knew. Samuel. The neighbor nodded. Your father wanted to find someone. Grant didn't. A chill ran through Nolan. Did you ever hear why? The old man frowned. One afternoon they were yelling so loud I could hear them from my porch. What did Grant say? The neighbor thought for a moment, then his face darkened. He said if Samuel came back, everything would change. The exact words, the same words written on the photograph. Nolan felt his pulse quicken. What happened after that? Your father stopped coming outside much. Then one day he was gone. The man hesitated. I always wondered if he left willingly. Nolan thanked him and returned to his car. The pieces were beginning to connect, but they still did not explain the money, or the fear, or why Arthur seemed more frightened of exposure than poverty. That afternoon Nolan returned to the motel. Arthur was sitting near the window. For the first time since being rescued from the highway stop, he looked somewhat comfortable. Clean clothes, a hot meal, a proper bed, simple things. Yet Nolan noticed something immediately. Arthur kept glancing toward the parking lot, as if expecting someone. Dad? Arthur looked up. Everything okay? Arthur forced a smile. Of course. Nolan didn't believe it. He sat across from him. I spoke to a neighbor. Arthur's shoulders tensed. What did he say? He heard arguments. Arthur looked away. That doesn't surprise me. He heard Samuel's name. The room grew quiet. Arthur stared at the floor. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he rubbed both hands together. Grant was never comfortable with Samuel. Why? Arthur hesitated. Because Samuel had rights. Rights to what? Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked toward the window. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tired. My father created a family trust. Nolan frowned. A trust? Arthur nodded. Years ago, was Samuel part of it? Yes. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Like something Arthur had carried alone for years. Then why wasn't he involved? Because he disappeared. And Grant? Arthur closed his eyes briefly. Grant believed Samuel should stay gone. Nolan felt the room becoming smaller. How much money are we talking about? Arthur turned toward him. This was never about the money for me. That isn't what I asked. Arthur sighed. No, it isn't. The silence confirmed everything. The amount mattered. A lot. Nolan leaned back. Suddenly he understood why Grant might have panicked. Not just greed, fear of losing control, fear of sharing, fear of becoming less important, but another question remained. If Samuel had vanished decades ago, why was Grant still so obsessed? Unless Nolan sat upright. Dad, Arthur looked at him. What if Samuel didn't disappear? Arthur froze. The reaction was immediate. Nolan saw it. A flash of hope, then pain, then fear. What do you mean? What if somebody made sure he stayed lost? Arthur stared at him. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Arthur lowered himself back into the chair. There were letters. Nolan's heartbeat quickened. What letters? I never told anyone. Dad, Arthur swallowed hard. A few years ago, I received a letter. The room seemed to stop moving. What did it say? Arthur looked toward the window again. It claimed Samuel was alive. Nolan felt every muscle tighten. Who sent it? I don't know. Where is it? Arthur's expression changed. Slowly, painfully, it disappeared. Nolan already knew the answer before asking. Grant? Arthur nodded once. The motel room fell silent. Outside, a truck rumbled through the parking lot. Inside, Nolan felt another piece of the truth slide into place. Not only had Grant blocked searches, not only had he isolated Arthur, someone had actively removed evidence whenever Samuel got close. Then Nolan's phone rang. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number. Normally, he would have ignored it. This time he answered. Hello. A woman's voice came through. Is this Nolan Mercer? Yes, my name is Rebecca Klein. Who is this? There was a brief pause. I'm a retired estate attorney. Nolan exchanged a look with Arthur. His pulse accelerated. I believe I have information regarding Samuel Mercer. Neither man moved. Then Rebecca said something that drained the color from Arthur's face. I think someone paid to make sure your family never found him. The motel room fell silent after the call ended. Nolan lowered the phone slowly and looked at Arthur. His father had not moved. The color had drained from his face. For a moment, he looked less like a man in his 70s and more like someone carrying a burden that had become too heavy to hold. "What did she say?" Arthur asked quietly. Nolan sat down. "She says someone paid to keep our family from finding Samuel." Arthur closed his eyes. The reaction was not surprise, it was exhaustion, as if part of him had feared that possibility for years. The next morning, Nolan arranged a meeting with Rebecca Klein. She lived nearly 2 hours away in a small town outside Columbia. The drive felt longer. Arthur insisted on coming. Neither man wanted to sit alone with unanswered questions anymore. Rebecca's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building overlooking the town square. She had retired years earlier but still maintained a small consulting practice. When Nolan and Arthur entered, she immediately stood. Her attention went directly to Arthur. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Rebecca smiled sadly. "It's been a long time." Arthur looked confused. "You know me? I met you once." Arthur searched his memory. Nothing came. Rebecca nodded. "Most people wouldn't remember." She gestured toward 2 chairs. "Please sit." The office felt calm. Books lined the walls. Legal files filled metal cabinets. Nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious, and yet Nolan felt his pulse rising. Rebecca opened a file folder that looked years old. "I first became involved 7 years ago." Arthur leaned forward. "Because of Samuel?" Rebecca nodded. "Because of a search request." The room became still. Arthur's hands tightened. "I filed dozens." "You did." Rebecca pulled several copies from the folder. To Nolan's surprise, they all contained Arthur's name: official inquiries, record requests, address searches, private investigator referrals. Years of effort, years of trying. Arthur stared at the papers. He looked like he was seeing old friends. "I thought most of these disappeared." Rebecca exchanged a glance with Nolan. "Some did." The answer hung in the room. Nolan immediately noticed something. The file was incomplete. Sections had been removed. Pages were missing. Dates skipped. Rebecca noticed his expression. "You're seeing the gaps." Nolan nodded. "What happened?" She took a breath. "Someone repeatedly requested copies of the file." "Who?" "I couldn't legally release names back then." Arthur suddenly sat straighter. "But now?" Rebecca folded her hands. "Now the records are old enough, and certain confidentiality restrictions have expired." Nolan's heartbeat quickened. Rebecca opened another folder. Inside were request forms. Several pages, several years. The same signature appeared again and again. Grant Mercer. Arthur looked away immediately. The hurt on his face was impossible to miss. Even after everything, even after the highway stop, even after the missing money, part of him still wanted to defend his son. Nolan did not. Not anymore. He kept checking the file, Nolan asked. Rebecca nodded. Every time a new lead appeared, Arthur's eyes widened. "What do you mean every time?" Rebecca turned another page. There were multiple leads. The room froze. Arthur looked stunned. "You found him?" "No." Rebecca shook her head. "We found traces." She pointed at several documents: former addresses, employment records, vehicle registrations, professional licenses. Every few years Sejamshul seemed to surface briefly, then disappear again. Arthur stared at the evidence. His breathing became uneven. For years he had believed every search ended in failure. Now he was discovering something worse. Some searches had succeeded. Someone had simply shut them down. "Who paid for that?" Nolan asked. Rebecca hesitated. "I don't know, but I know money was involved." She reached into another folder. Inside was a photocopy of a cashier's check. The name of the recipient had been redacted, but the issuing account holder remained visible. Mercer Holdings LLC. Nolan immediately recognized it. Grant's company. Arthur looked sick. Rebecca continued carefully. "I can't prove the purpose of the payment, but the timing is suspicious." The check was issued less than 2 weeks after one of Samuel's strongest leads appeared. Nolan felt anger spreading through his chest. Not because of the money. Because of the time. Every missing year. Every unanswered letter. Every lonely night Arthur spent searching. Someone had turned all of it into a strategy. Arthur suddenly stood and walked toward the window. Nobody stopped him. His shoulders looked smaller than before, more fragile. Rebecca lowered her voice. "There is something else." Nolan looked up. "What?" She pulled out a sealed envelope, older than the rest, yellowed with age. Arthur slowly turned around. The moment he saw it, his eyes widened. "No." Rebecca nodded. "Yes." Arthur stared at the envelope as if it were a ghost. Nolan looked between them. What is it? Rebecca placed it carefully on the desk. It arrived 6 years ago. Arthur's voice cracked the letter. Rebecca nodded again. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Nolan looked back at his father. The letter you said disappeared? Arthur swallowed hard. Yes. Rebecca pushed the envelope forward. It never disappeared. Arthur stared at her. What? It was intercepted. The room went silent. Nolan could actually hear the wall clock ticking. Rebecca continued. The letter reached our office because your inquiry file listed us as a forwarding contact. Arthur could barely speak. You had it all this time? No. Rebecca shook her head. It was removed from the file shortly after it arrived. Nolan already knew where this was going. His jaw tightened. Grant, Rebecca didn't answer directly, but she didn't need to. Arthur slowly lowered himself into the chair again. His hands trembled. Years of pain sat inside that envelope. Years. Rebecca carefully slid it across the desk. I kept a copy before it disappeared. Arthur looked as though he might break. Did Samuel write it? Rebecca nodded. Yes. Nobody spoke. Finally, Nolan reached for the envelope. His fingers stopped halfway. He looked at Arthur. You should open it. Arthur stared at the letter. The room felt smaller with every passing second. Slowly, he reached forward. His trembling fingers slipped beneath the seal. The paper inside crackled softly. He unfolded it. His eyes moved across the first few lines. Then suddenly he froze. Completely froze. The blood drained from his face. Nolan immediately stood. Dad? Arthur didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the page. Rebecca looked concerned. Arthur? Finally he lifted his head. Tears had formed in his eyes. Not from sadness, from shock, pure shock. He looked directly at Nolan, then whispered 4 words that changed everything. Samuel found me first. Arthur's hands shook so badly that the letter nearly slipped from his fingers. Nolan moved closer, but he didn't interrupt. The old man stared at the page as though the past had suddenly come alive in front of him. Rebecca remained silent. She seemed to understand that some truths needed room to breathe. Finally, Arthur swallowed hard and continued reading. His eyes moved slowly across each line. Then he lowered the paper. He found me, Arthur repeated. He actually found me. Nolan sat beside him. What did he say? Arthur looked down at the letter again. His voice was barely above a whisper. He said he'd been looking for me for years. The room fell quiet. Every assumption Nolan had carried was beginning to crack. Arthur continued. He said he hired investigators. He searched old records. He contacted relatives. He tried everything. Arthur paused. Then he laughed once. A sad, broken laugh. And all this time I thought he didn't care. Nolan felt a heaviness settle inside him. Years had been stolen from both men, not by distance, not by fate, by choices. Arthur kept reading, then suddenly his expression changed. What is it? Nolan asked. Arthur handed him the letter. Read this part. Nolan took it carefully. The handwriting was neat but uneven with age. He found the section Arthur indicated. The words immediately caught his attention. I finally obtained your mailing address from a legal referral office. If this letter reaches you, please call me immediately. Someone has been warning people not to help me locate you. I do not know why. I only know that every time I get close, the trail disappears. Nolan read the passage twice, then a third time. A cold feeling spread through his chest. Samuel had noticed the interference years ago, long before Arthur did, long before Nolan knew anything was wrong. The manipulation stretched further back than anyone realized. Rebecca leaned forward. There's something important you should understand. Both men looked at her. The people handling Samuel's searches weren't amateurs. Nolan frowned. What do you mean? They weren't simply ignoring requests. Rebecca opened another file. There was coordination. The word landed heavily. She slid several copies across the desk. Investigator reports, search requests, administrative notes. Most seemed routine, until Nolan noticed a pattern. Every time Samuel got close to Arthur's location, somebody contacted the agency involved. Then the inquiry stalled. Every single time. Who contacted them? Nolan asked. Rebecca shook her head. Some records are incomplete, but several agencies documented pressure from a representative connected to Mercer Holdings. Grant's company, again. Arthur lowered his head. The disappointment seemed almost physical. A father could survive poverty. A father could survive loneliness. But discovering what his own son might have done was different. Much different. Nolan placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. The old man didn't speak, but he didn't pull away either. That alone said a lot. For the next hour, they reviewed documents. Some answers emerged, many questions remained. Then Rebecca produced one final folder. Unlike the others, it looked newer. Its contents were more recent. Nolan immediately noticed several legal documents, trust records, financial disclosures, estate planning paperwork. His attention sharpened. "What is this?" Rebecca folded her arms. "This is where things become complicated." Arthur looked exhausted. "I thought they were already complicated." Rebecca offered a faint smile. "They are." She pointed toward a specific section, the family trust. Arthur's face immediately darkened. Nolan noticed. "You knew about this?" Arthur nodded. "Of course, why didn't you tell me?" Arthur hesitated, then looked away. "Because I didn't want you dragged into it." That answer only increased Nolan's concern. Rebecca opened the folder. "The Mercer family trust was established by your grandfather." Nolan listened carefully. The original trust named multiple beneficiaries. Arthur remained silent. Rebecca continued. "One of them was Samuel Mercer." There it was again, the same connection, the same hidden thread running beneath everything. Nolan leaned forward. How much was he entitled to? Rebecca shook her head. "The amount isn't the important part." "What is?" "The fact that his share never legally disappeared." The room became still. Arthur closed his eyes, as though hearing words he'd feared for years. Rebecca continued. "If Samuel is alive, certain questions about the trust become active again." Nolan immediately understood. Grant wasn't merely protecting money, he was protecting control. Control over decisions, control over assets, control over the family narrative. Everything suddenly felt bigger: the missing letters, the intercepted emails, the sold house, Arthur living beside a highway stop. None of those things stood alone. They connected. They all pointed toward the same objective: keep Samuel gone. At any cost. Nolan sat back, his mind was racing. Then he made a decision. "We need to find him." Arthur looked up. For the first time that day, hope appeared in his eyes. Real hope. Not certainty, but possibility. Rebecca nodded slowly. "I agree." Nolan turned toward her. "Can you help us?" She hesitated, then reached into her desk drawer. Inside was a small envelope, much smaller than the letter, much newer. She placed it carefully on the desk. "I wasn't sure whether to show you this." Nolan immediately felt tension return. "What is it?" Rebecca looked directly at Arthur. 3 months ago, someone contacted me." Arthur froze. The room seemed to stop moving again. "Who?" Rebecca slid the envelope across the desk. There was no return address, no phone number, no full name, only initials. Arthur slowly picked it up. His fingers trembled. "What did it say?" Rebecca's expression turned serious. It contained a photograph. Nolan exchanged a glance with his father. Arthur carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a recently printed photo. Not old, not faded. Recent, very recent. The picture showed an elderly man standing outside a small cabin near a lake. He appeared to be in his 70s, gray-haired, thin, weathered, yet strangely familiar. Arthur stared at the image, then suddenly inhaled sharply. The room went silent. Nolan looked from the photograph to his father's face. Arthur's eyes were filling with tears. Not because he was certain, because he was terrified to hope. Slowly he pointed at the man in the picture. Then he whispered the name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Samuel. But before anyone could speak again, Nolan noticed something else. In the lower corner of the photograph, partially reflected in the cabin window behind Samuel, stood another figure, a man, watching, and even though the reflection was blurry, Nolan recognized him immediately. Grant. Nolan took the photograph from Arthur's hands and stared at the reflection again. The image was grainy. The figure behind Samuel was partially obscured by glare from the cabin window. Yet the posture looked familiar. The broad shoulders, the stance, even the jacket. Nolan had seen it countless times. "Grant." Rebecca leaned closer. "You recognize him too?" Nolan nodded slowly. "I think I do." Arthur looked between them. His eyes remained fixed on the photo, not on the reflection. On Samuel. For years he had imagined what his brother might look like. Now the image was finally real. Older. Worn down, alive. Arthur touched the corner of the photograph carefully, almost reverently. "I thought I would never see his face again." The room became quiet. Then Nolan forced himself back to the larger problem. "When was this taken?" Rebecca opened her notes. "The envelope arrived 3 months ago, but the photo itself appears newer, maybe within the last year." Nolan's mind immediately began working. If Grant appeared in the reflection, then Grant knew where Samuel was. Maybe he had known for years. The realization made his stomach tighten. Arthur had spent nights sleeping beside an abandoned highway stop, while Grant possibly knew exactly where the man they were searching for lived. Nolan looked up. Can we determine where this cabin is? Rebecca nodded slightly possibly. She pointed toward the background. There are clues, a lake, a dock, a registration number on a boat, a partial sign attached to a utility pole. Small details, but enough to investigate. For the next hour they carefully photographed and scanned everything. Nolan uploaded copies into his laptop. Years of building a technology company had taught him how to organize information. For the first time, the search felt active rather than emotional, not hope, direction. When they finally left Rebecca's office, Arthur seemed different. Not happier, but steadier. The uncertainty that had haunted him for years was beginning to shrink. Samuel had not abandoned him. That truth alone changed something deep inside him. As they reached the parking lot, Nolan's phone rang. Grant. The name flashed across the screen. Arthur immediately saw it. His expression darkened. Neither man spoke. The phones continued ringing, then stopped. A second later, a text message appeared. Call me now. Nolan stared at it. Another message followed. I've been trying to reach Dad. Where is he? Arthur looked away. The fear Nolan had noticed at the highway stop returned instantly. Not terror, something more complicated, the fear of disappointment. The fear of finally accepting what someone had become. Nolan made a decision. He put the phone back in his pocket. I'm not calling him. Arthur looked surprised. You should. No. Arthur frowned. Nolan, no. The word came out harder than intended. Several people in the parking lot glanced over. Nolan lowered his voice. For years he controlled the conversation. Not anymore. Arthur studied him carefully, then slowly nodded. For once he did not argue. The drive back to the motel was quiet. Arthur spent most of it staring out the window. Nolan knew what he was thinking. Samuel, the letter, the photograph, the years lost, and somewhere beneath all of it sat another question. Why? Why had Grant done this? Money alone no longer felt sufficient. The pieces didn't fully fit. Not yet. That evening Nolan received another call, this time from someone he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it. Then answered. Hello, a man's voice came through. Mr. Mercer? Yes. My name is David Warren. The name meant nothing. What can I do for you? There was hesitation on the other end. Then the man spoke quietly. I worked for your brother. Nolan sat upright, immediately alert. What kind of work? Financial consulting. Nolan's pulse accelerated. What do you want? Another pause. Then the answer came. I think your father is in danger. Nolan stood. Across the room Arthur looked up. Danger from who? The man exhaled heavily. From Grant. The conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. By the end, Nolan felt physically sick. David had worked with Mercer Holdings for almost 6 years. During that time, he handled internal records, asset transfers, corporate accounts, trust-related paperwork. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then he noticed discrepancies, small ones, money moving between entities, consulting payments without clear justification, private investigators, administrative expenses, search firms, document retrieval services, everything connected to one name, Samuel Mercer. Nolan wrote notes as quickly as possible. Are you saying Grant paid people to monitor him? Yes. Can you prove it? David hesitated. Maybe. Not exactly the answer Nolan wanted, but it was something. Then David said something far worse. There were discussions about Arthur. Nolan froze. What kind of discussions? The man's voice became lower. There were concerns that Arthur was getting close to locating Samuel. Nolan felt anger building. So your brother wanted to limit his ability to act. A cold silence filled the room. Arthur had stopped pretending not to listen. He sat completely still, waiting. Nolan tightened his grip on the phone. What exactly does that mean? David hesitated again. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded uncomfortable. There were conversations about obtaining legal authority over Arthur. Neither Nolan nor Arthur moved. What kind of authority? Guardianship. The word hit like a punch. Arthur's face went pale. Nolan immediately understood the implications. If successful, Grant could control finances, medical decisions, housing arrangements, communication, everything. The old man beside him suddenly looked smaller, more vulnerable. Not because he was weak, because somebody had been preparing to take away his choices. David continued. I don't know how far the plan got, but paperwork existed. Drafts, evaluations, attorney consultations. Nolan felt his jaw tighten. Can you send me what you have? I can. But there's a problem. Of course there was. What problem? I wasn't supposed to keep copies. Nolan closed his eyes briefly. David, I'm trying to help. I know, but if I give you everything, Grant will know it came from me. The fear in the man's voice sounded genuine. Nolan understood. This wasn't a movie. Whistleblowers had real consequences, especially in small communities. I'll protect your identity, David laughed sadly. I hope so. Before ending the call, he agreed to send several documents. Nothing more, for now. When the call ended, the room remained silent. Arthur looked exhausted. He sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed his face. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Arthur surprised him. I don't want to hide anymore. Nolan looked up. His father slowly straightened his shoulders. The movement seemed small, but it mattered. I spent too many years reacting. Arthur looked toward the photograph of Samuel. If Grant wants a fight, then let him explain himself. Nolan nodded. For the first time, Arthur sounded like the man he remembered, not defeated, determined. An hour later, an encrypted email arrived from David. Nolan downloaded the attachments immediately. Financial records, internal memos, legal correspondence, dozens of files. He began reviewing them one by one. Most were complicated, some were incomplete. Then one document stopped him cold. It wasn't a financial record, it wasn't a legal memo, it was a medical evaluation request, prepared by a law firm. Requested by Grant Mercer. Subject, Arthur Mercer. Nolan's eyes moved down the page. Then he reached the final paragraph, and suddenly understood why Grant had become desperate. Because attached to the request was a handwritten note. A note Grant never expected anyone else to read. If Samuel is located before guardianship is finalized, the entire situation becomes uncontrollable. Nolan stared at the words, then opened the next attachment, and found something even worse. A scheduled court filing date, only 9 days away. Nolan stared at the court filing date for several seconds. 9 days. That was all. 9 days before Grant attempted to gain legal control over Arthur's affairs. 9 days before a judge might begin considering whether Arthur could make decisions for himself. Arthur read the document twice, then a third time. When he finally lowered the page, his expression had changed. The sadness was still there. The disappointment remained, but something else had appeared beneath it. Resolve, he thinks I'm helpless. Nolan looked at him. Arthur folded the document carefully and placed it on the table. He thinks I'm already beaten. The old man's voice was calm. Too calm. That worried Nolan more than anger would have. For years Arthur had tolerated disappointment. Now he was seeing the full shape of it. Not neglect, not misunderstanding, a campaign. One that had been quietly unfolding for years. The next morning Nolan contacted an attorney. Not a corporate attorney, not one of his business lawyers, someone experienced in elder rights and contested guardianship cases. By noon they were sitting inside a law office in Columbia. The attorney's name was Rachel Donovan. She reviewed the documents without interruption, the financial records, the intercepted letters, the trust documents, the court filing notice, the missing support payments. Every page seemed to darken her expression. Finally she set the file down. This is serious. Nolan nodded. We know. Rachel looked directly at Arthur. Do you understand why your son is concerned? Arthur gave a small smile. I do. Then let me ask you directly. Rachel folded her hands. Do you want someone else making your decisions for you? Arthur's answer came instantly. No. Do you know where you are right now? Your office. Do you know today's date? Arthur answered correctly. Rachel continued with several more questions. Simple questions, practical questions, questions designed to evaluate orientation and reasoning. Arthur answered all of them without difficulty. When she finished, she leaned back. This doesn't look like someone incapable of managing his affairs. Nolan felt relief. Not because the fight was over, because it wasn't, but because Arthur was finally being seen, not as a burden, not as a problem, as a person. Rachel continued reviewing the evidence. Eventually she pointed toward the trust documents. This may become important. Nolan leaned forward. The trust? Rachel nodded. Guardianship and inheritance aren't the same issue, but they can influence each other. Arthur's eyes narrowed. You think Grant knows that? I think Grant understands exactly what's at stake. The room fell silent. Rachel opened another section of the file. What concerns me most is timing. Nolan knew what she meant. The guardianship filing, the photograph. The evidence Samuel was alive. Everything was happening at once. Too close together, too coordinated, as if somebody feared running out of time. That thought stayed with Nolan long after they left the office. Something was changing. Grant knew it. That was why he was moving faster. Later that afternoon, Nolan returned to the motel alone. Arthur wanted rest. The last few days had exhausted him. As Nolan entered his room, he found several missed calls, all from Grant. A new voicemail waited. Nolan hesitated, then pressed play. Grant's voice filled the room. "Nolan, I don't know what Dad has been telling you." A pause. "But you're making a mistake." Another pause. "Longer this time. Call me before this gets worse." The message ended. Nolan listened again. Not because he doubted what he heard, because something felt strange. Grant sounded nervous, not angry. Nervous. That realization stayed with him. Grant was losing control, and he knew it. That evening, Nolan received another message. This one came from David Warren, only 4 words. "Check file 19. Nothing else. Nolan immediately opened the encrypted folder. File 19 sat near the bottom. Until now, he had ignored it. The title seemed unimportant. Administrative correspondence. He clicked it open. The document contained dozens of emails, routine business exchanges, expense approvals, vendor discussions. Nothing remarkable. Then one email stopped him. It wasn't sent by Grant. It was sent to Grant. Nolan read it carefully, then read it again. The sender was an investigator. The subject line contained only a case number. The body was short. "Samuel Mercer has been located. Current residence confirmed. Awaiting instructions before contact." Nolan felt his pulse quicken. The email was nearly 3 years old. 3 years. 3 years before Arthur ended up beside the highway stop. 3 years before the photograph arrived. 3 years before Nolan returned home. Samuel had already been found. Nolan immediately searched for the response. Several messages followed. Most were missing, deleted, redacted, unavailable. But one survived. A single sentence. "Do not initiate contact." Nothing more. No explanation, no justification, just instructions. Nolan sat back slowly. His hands tightened into fists. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Grant hadn't simply interfered with searches. He had actively stopped reunification. Not once, repeatedly. For years, Nolan printed the email immediately, then saved multiple copies, one on his laptop, one in cloud storage, one on an encrypted drive. He was finished taking chances. Hours later, he drove back to Arthur's motel. The old man was awake, reading Samuel's letter again. He looked up when Nolan entered. "Any news?" Nolan handed him the printed email. Arthur read silently. The room became very still. When he finished, he set the paper down, then looked out the window. His eyes appeared distant, almost haunted. For a long time he didn't speak. Finally, he whispered something Nolan barely heard. He knew Nolan frowned. "What?" Arthur looked at him. Grant knew where Samuel was. The sentence sounded different when Arthur said it. More personal, more painful. Because it wasn't merely evidence anymore. It was betrayal, pure betrayal. The old man sat quietly for several moments. Then something unexpected happened. He stood, walked to his suitcase, opened an inside compartment, and removed a small leather notebook. Nolan had never seen it before. Arthur carried it back to the table. "What is that?" Arthur stared at it for several seconds. "My search journal." Nolan blinked. "You kept records?" Arthur nodded. "Every lead, every investigator, every address, every conversation, for years." The realization stunned Nolan. Arthur opened the notebook. Hundreds of handwritten entries filled the pages. Dates, names, phone numbers, observations, memories. The record of a man who refused to give up on family. Then Arthur stopped at one page. His expression changed immediately. "What is it?" Arthur's fingers tightened around the notebook. Slowly, he turned it toward Nolan. A name had been circled repeatedly. Written beside it was a note dated almost 4 years earlier. Possible witness. Claims Samuel already knows about the Mercer family trust. Refused to talk. Said he was warned. Nolan stared at the entry. Then at the name. His pulse accelerated because he recognized it instantly. The witness wasn't a stranger. It wasn't an investigator. It wasn't a lawyer. It was Samuel's own attorney. And according to the address written beside the name, the man still maintained an office less than 50 miles away. Arthur looked at Nolan. Hope and fear collided in his eyes. Neither man spoke, because they both understood the same thing. If that attorney was willing to talk now, he might know exactly where Samuel was. The next morning, Nolan and Arthur left before sunrise. Neither had slept much. The address from Arthur's notebook led to a small law office near a lakeside community 2 counties away. It wasn't impressive. The building was old, the sign weathered, and the parking lot half empty. But to Arthur, it felt like the most important place in the world. For 4 years, that name had sat inside his notebook. For 4 years, he had stared at it without knowing whether it would ever matter. Now they were finally here. The attorney's name was Michael Hastings. He was in his late 60s and looked surprised when Arthur introduced himself. For several seconds, Michael simply stared, then he slowly removed his glasses. "I honestly never thought I'd meet you." Arthur's heart began pounding. "You know who I am?" Michael nodded. "I've known who you are for years." The answer landed heavily. Nolan exchanged a look with his father. Another piece of the puzzle, another person who knew more than they did. Michael invited them into his office and closed the door. The room smelled faintly of old books and coffee. Nobody sat immediately. Arthur remained standing. His hands trembled slightly. "Please tell me one thing." Michael looked at him carefully. "Is Samuel alive?" The attorney hesitated, not because he didn't know, because he understood what the answer meant. Finally he nodded. "Yes." Arthur closed his eyes. The room seemed to disappear around him. After years of searching, after years of doubt, after years of believing he might never know, the answer was yes. Samuel was alive. When Arthur opened his eyes again, they were wet. Not with grief, with relief. A burden he had carried for decades had finally shifted. Nolan moved closer but said nothing. Some moments didn't need words. Michael waited until Arthur sat down. Then he spoke again. "Samuel never stopped looking for you." Arthur looked up immediately. The statement struck him almost as hard as the confirmation itself. "What?" Michael opened a cabinet and removed several folders. "Your brother hired me almost 5 years ago." Arthur stared. "He hired you?" Michael nodded. "He wanted legal guidance." "About what?" "About reconnecting." The room became quiet. Michael opened one of the folders. Inside were letters, copies, notes, phone records, search requests. Arthur stared at them in disbelief. There were dozens, maybe more. Everyone represented an attempt, everyone represented hope, and everyone had failed. Michael slowly turned pages. Samuel wrote letters. He hired investigators. He tracked addresses. He contacted agencies. He even prepared a trust affidavit in case something happened to him before he found you. Arthur lowered his head. The weight of those lost years felt almost unbearable. Not because Samuel had disappeared, because he hadn't. Both brothers had been searching. Both had cared, both had been prevented. Nolan felt his own anger growing. Every new piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. Somebody had benefited from keeping them apart. And that somebody had a name, Grant. Michael seemed to sense the thought. His expression darkened. "There is something else you need to know." Nolan immediately focused. "What?" The attorney folded his hands. Samuel wasn't the only person being watched. Arthur frowned. "What do you mean?" Michael looked directly at him. "You were." The room went still. Arthur blinked. "Watched?" Michael nodded. For years, Nolan felt his pulse quicken. "By who?" The attorney hesitated, then answered carefully. "I can't prove who ordered it, but I know someone repeatedly requested updates whenever your location changed." Arthur looked genuinely confused. "My location?" Michael nodded. "Addresses, phone numbers, employment, medical status." The words felt invasive, uncomfortable, wrong. Arthur sat perfectly still. Nolan was already thinking ahead. Someone wasn't simply blocking communication, someone was monitoring both sides, maintaining separation, managing information like a gatekeeper, Michael continued. Every time Samuel got close, the trail went cold. Arthur looked exhausted. "How?" The attorney opened another file. Inside were printed emails, investigator reports, expense invoices. Several names had been redacted, others had not. Nolan leaned forward, froze. One name appeared repeatedly, Mercer Holdings, again always nearby, always present, never directly involved, yet somehow connected to everything. Michael watched their reaction. I don't think that was accidental. Neither did Nolan. At this point, coincidence was no longer believable. There was too much evidence. Too many years, too many interventions. Arthur stared out the office window. The lake shimmered in the distance. For a moment he looked very old, not because of age, because of loss. Then he surprised everyone. What kind of man is Samuel now? Michael smiled faintly. The question seemed to touch him. A good one. Arthur looked back. Michael nodded. A stubborn one. A small laugh escaped Arthur. The first genuine laugh Nolan had heard since finding him. Michael continued, "He lives quietly, he volunteers, he keeps mostly to himself. But every Christmas he asked me the same question." Arthur's expression softened. "What question?" Michael looked at him carefully. "Have you found my brother yet?" Silence filled the room. Arthur looked away, unable to hide his emotions. For several moments nobody spoke. Then Nolan asked the question that mattered most. "Where is he?" The room shifted instantly. Michael's smile disappeared, the atmosphere changed. Arthur noticed it too. Something was wrong, very wrong. Michael slowly removed another folder. Unlike the others, this one looked recent. Its contents had been updated only weeks ago. The attorney stared at it for several seconds before opening it. Then he slid a document across the desk. Arthur picked it up first. Nolan watched his father's expression change. Confusion, concern, shock. "What is it?" Nolan asked. Arthur handed over the page. Nolan read it. His stomach tightened immediately. The document wasn't a letter, it wasn't an address, it wasn't a legal filing. It was a hospital admission record. Recent, very recent, patient, Samuel Mercer, status, critical condition. Nolan looked up instantly. Michael nodded slowly. 3 weeks ago, Arthur's face had gone pale. "What happened?" Michael sighed. "A heart condition." The room became silent. Every second suddenly felt more valuable. Every lost year felt crueler. Arthur gripped the edge of the desk. "Where is he now?" Michael looked at both men, then finally answered, "That's why I agreed to meet you." He reached into the folder and removed a folded piece of paper, an address, a hospital, several hours away. Arthur stared at it, his hands trembling again. After decades of searching, after decades of being kept apart, his brother was finally within reach. Then Michael spoke one final sentence, and everything became urgent. "If you want to see Samuel," he said quietly, "you need to leave today." Arthur insisted on leaving within the hour. No one argued with him. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it should have. Rain moved across the highway in thin gray sheets, and the sky hung low over the Missouri countryside. Nolan stayed focused on the road, but his attention kept drifting to the folded hospital records sitting on the dashboard. Samuel was alive, yet after decades of searching, they might still be too late. Arthur sat silently beside him for most of the trip. He looked out the window and watched familiar towns pass by. Every few miles, Nolan glanced toward him. The fear on Arthur's face wasn't fear of death, it was fear of unfinished words. By late afternoon, they arrived at St. Gabriel Medical Center. The hospital was larger than Nolan expected. Nurses moved quickly through the halls. Visitors sat quietly in waiting areas. Life and loss existed side by side in every corner of the building. Arthur approached the reception desk before Nolan could speak. His voice shook slightly. "I'm here to see Samuel Mercer." The receptionist typed for several moments. Then her expression softened. "Family?" Arthur swallowed. "Brother." The words seemed strange after so many years. The receptionist checked another screen. Then she looked back up. "I'm sorry. Only approved visitors are currently allowed." Arthur froze. "What?" The patient requested a limited access list. Nolan stepped forward. "There has to be some mistake." The receptionist remained polite. "I'm sorry." Arthur's shoulders dropped. For a moment he looked exactly like the man Nolan had found beside the abandoned highway stop. Small, defeated, alone. Then the receptionist frowned slightly. "Wait," she typed again. A few seconds later she picked up the phone. After a brief conversation, she hung up and looked directly at Arthur. "Mr. Mercer?" "Yes. Someone left instructions in case you ever arrived." The words hit both men instantly. Arthur stared. "What instructions?" The receptionist handed him a sealed envelope. His name was written across the front in shaky handwriting. Arthur Mercer, no address, no date, just his name. Arthur held it carefully, as if it might disappear. Neither he nor Nolan spoke while he opened it. Inside was a single page, a short handwritten note. Arthur read silently. Then his hands began trembling. Nolan took the letter. The message was simple. "Arthur, if you're reading this, then you finally found me. I never stopped trying to find you too. If I cannot speak when you arrive, there is something you must know. You were never the reason I stayed away. Ask for room 417, and ask about Evelyn." Samuel Nolan read the note twice, then a third time. One name immediately stood to Evelyn. Neither of them recognized it. Arthur looked confused. "Who is Evelyn?" Nolan shook his head. "I don't know." The mystery only deepened. They followed directions to the 4th floor. Outside room 417, a cardiologist met them before they entered. Samuel's condition had stabilized, but only temporarily. His recovery remained uncertain, stress needed to be minimized, conversations should be brief. The doctor explained everything carefully. Arthur listened, then interrupted. "Will he know who I am?" The doctor paused. "I believe so." That was enough. When the door finally opened, Arthur stopped walking. For several seconds he simply stared. The man lying in the hospital bed looked older than Arthur had imagined. Thinner, frailer, but something remained unmistakable. The eyes, the shape of the jaw, the resemblance, not identical, but enough to erase decades of doubt. Samuel slowly turned his head. His gaze landed on Arthur. For a moment neither man moved. Then Samuel smiled, a weak smile, but real. Arthur's eyes filled immediately. Samuel spoke first about time. The tension shattered. Arthur laughed through tears. So did Samuel. Nolan quietly stepped back toward the doorway. Some reunions belonged to the people who had waited for them. The brothers talked for nearly an hour. Not about money, not about property, not even about Grant. They talked about years lost, questions left unanswered, people they missed, promises they never got the chance to keep. Again and again, Samuel repeated the same thing. "I tried." Arthur believed him. For the first time, he fully understood the scale of the deception. Neither brother had abandoned the other. Someone had built walls between them, and someone had maintained those walls for years. Eventually, Samuel grew tired. His breathing became heavier. The doctor signaled that the visit needed to end soon. Before leaving, Arthur asked the question that had haunted him for years. "Why did you tell me to ask about Evelyn?" Samuel's expression changed instantly. The warmth faded, concern replaced it. He looked toward the door, then toward Nolan. Finally, he lowered his voice. "Because she's the reason Grant got scared." The room went silent. Arthur frowned. "What does that mean?" Samuel hesitated. Even now, he seemed unsure how much to reveal. Then he reached toward the bedside drawer. Inside sat an old leather folder, worn, creased, protected. He handed it to Arthur. "I kept everything." Arthur accepted it carefully. "What is it?" "Proof." The answer came without hesitation. "Proof of what?" Samuel looked directly at Nolan. "Proof that Grant knew the truth years before any of us realized it." Nolan felt his chest tighten. The room suddenly felt smaller. Samuel continued. "Evelyn worked for a trust administration company. She discovered something she wasn't supposed to find." Arthur opened the folder slightly. Inside were copies of legal documents, correspondence, handwritten notes. Some appeared decades old, others much newer. Samuel watched his brother carefully. "Don't open it here." Arthur immediately understood. Something inside mattered. A lot. Samuel's breathing became uneven. The effort of speaking was clearly exhausting him. The doctor stepped forward. "That's enough for today." Samuel nodded weakly, then looked at Arthur one last time. "There isn't much time." Arthur gripped the folder. "What aren't you telling me?" Samuel's eyes moved toward Nolan, then back to Arthur. A shadow crossed his face. Not fear, regret, the kind that comes from carrying a secret too long. "Evelyn found a document." Arthur leaned closer. "What document?" Samuel swallowed. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "The original trust records." Nolan felt a chill run through him. The doctor moved closer. The conversation was ending. Samuel knew it too. He grabbed Arthur's wrist unexpectedly. His grip was surprisingly firm. Grant wasn't protecting money. Arthur stared. What was he protecting? Samuel opened his mouth to answer. But before he could speak, the heart monitor suddenly began sounding faster. Nurses rushed into the room. The doctor immediately moved between them. Everyone was ordered outside. The door closed. Arthur stood frozen in the hallway, still holding the leather folder, still hearing Samuel's unfinished sentence. Grant wasn't protecting money. He was protecting something else, and whatever it was had been hidden inside that folder for years. As Arthur looked down at the worn leather cover, he noticed something neither he nor Samuel had mentioned. A faded photograph was partially visible between the documents. The image showed Samuel standing beside a woman, and in her hand was a notarized document bearing the Mercer family name. Across the bottom, barely visible beneath the photograph, were 4 handwritten words: "Do not let Grant see." The folder changed everything, not overnight, not with a single dramatic confession. The truth came out the way most real truths did, through records, signatures, emails, witness statements, and weeks of verification. Evelyn had been an administrator for the trust company that managed part of the Mercer family assets. Years earlier, she discovered discrepancies involving family records and inheritance filings. Samuel's name had been removed from key documents that should have recognized him as a legal beneficiary. When Evelyn questioned the changes, she documented everything. When Samuel learned what she found, he kept copies. And when Grant discovered they were asking questions, he began doing what he had always done. He buried the truth. The investigation uncovered years of interference, letters that never arrived, email accounts redirected, property transfers pushed through while Arthur trusted family members who were supposed to protect him. Some actions carried legal consequences. Others carried consequences that no courtroom could fully measure. For the first time, Grant could no longer control the story. The family meeting took place 6 weeks later. Samuel was still recovering but strong enough to attend. Arthur insisted on being there in person. Nolan sat beside him as attorneys reviewed the findings. Grant looked older than anyone remembered, not because of age, because there was nowhere left to hide. When confronted with the documents, he stopped denying the facts. He admitted blocking communication. He admitted hiding information about Samuel. He admitted discouraging Arthur from continuing the search. But when Arthur asked the question that mattered most, Grant's voice finally cracked. Why? The room fell silent. Grant stared at the table for several seconds. Then he answered honestly for the first time in years, because I was afraid. Arthur frowned. Afraid of what? Grant laughed bitterly, being nobody. The words sounded pathetic and devastating at the same time. He explained how he had spent decades living in the shadow of family expectations. Samuel had always been the missing mystery. Arthur had always been the one people loved. Grant stayed. Grant handled responsibilities. Grant sacrificed opportunities. At least that was how he saw it. Then one day he became convinced that if Samuel returned, everything he had built would disappear: influence, control, importance. He told himself he was protecting the family. Eventually he realized he was protecting himself. No one spoke for a long moment. Even Nolan felt something complicated. Not sympathy, not forgiveness, just sadness. So much destruction had grown from one man's fear of being forgotten. The legal proceedings continued over the following months. Financial corrections were made. Property disputes were resolved. Arthur regained complete control over his affairs. Independent evaluations confirmed what Nolan already knew. Arthur had never lost his ability to make his own decisions. He had only lost people willing to listen to him. The old house could not be recovered. Too much time had passed. But other things could. Samuel's name was formally restored to family records. Photographs once hidden away were displayed openly. Documents that had been locked in boxes were shared among relatives. For the first time in decades, nobody acted as if Samuel had never existed. That mattered more than any financial settlement. One evening, Nolan sat with Arthur and Samuel on the porch of Arthur's new home. The three men watched the sunset sink behind the trees. It was quiet, comfortable, the kind of silence families rarely appreciated until they almost lost it forever. Nolan finally spoke. "I owe both of you an apology." Neither man answered immediately. Nolan looked down at his hands. "I thought sending money was enough." Arthur's expression softened. Nolan continued. "I built companies, expanded overseas, solved problems for thousands of employees. But somehow I convinced myself that monthly transfers meant I was taking care of my father." The admission hurt, because it was true. He had been manipulated, but he had also been absent. Arthur reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You came back." Nolan looked at him. Arthur smiled faintly. "A lot of people never do." The words stayed with him. Weeks later, Grant requested a private meeting. Arthur almost refused. Then he agreed. Once, only on his terms. They met at a small diner outside town. No lawyers, no audience, no family pressure. Just two aging brothers sitting across from each other. Grant apologized, not dramatically, not perfectly. He did not ask for immediate forgiveness. He simply admitted the damage he had caused. Arthur listened. When Grant finished, the silence lingered. Finally Arthur spoke. "I don't hate you." Grant lowered his eyes. "But trust doesn't come back because someone says sorry." Grant nodded slowly. He understood. Arthur was offering something smaller than reconciliation, but more honest, a boundary, a chance to do better without pretending the past never happened. When they left the diner, neither man knew what their future relationship would become. For the first time, that future would be built on truth instead of control. Several months later, Arthur asked Nolan to drive him somewhere. Nolan recognized the route immediately. Neither spoke much during the trip. The abandoned highway stop appeared exactly as it had before. Weathered signs, cracked pavement, empty parking spaces. A forgotten place beside a road most travelers barely noticed. The place where Nolan had found his father. The place where everything changed. Arthur stepped out of the truck slowly. The wind moved across the open fields. For a long moment he simply stood there, looking, remembering, not the humiliation, not the loneliness, not the betrayal. He remembered the choice he almost most lost, the right to tell his own story. Samuel joined them a few moments later. The three men stood together facing the old highway stop. Nobody said much. Words weren't necessary anymore. After a while Arthur smiled. Not a perfect smile, not a healed smile, but a peaceful one. The kind that only appears after someone stops carrying a burden alone. Then he turned away from the abandoned stop and walked back toward his family, toward the road home. If you were Arthur, would you have forgiven Grant after everything that happened? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for spending this journey with the Mercer family.